Hey, Lincoln Avenue. Today's psalm is Psalm 137, one of the hardest psalms in the scriptures, and so particularly has a very hard ending. And so I think there's a good reason for us to just kind of walk through this. And so Psalm 137 is written in the exile, which means that the Israelite people have just experienced one of the most horrific atrocities that any people could experience. The Babylonians have come in and they have wiped out their city, and they have killed men, women, and children in horrific ways. And so now the rest of them have been taken away to Babylon. They're slaves in Babylon. They're in exile. And while they're in exile, the Babylonians are taunting them. They're saying, hey, sing us your songs. Sing us the songs of Israel, the songs about your God, the songs about your nation, the songs about all this victory. And in the midst of that, the psalmist is coming to God with his pain. And the first thing he does in verses 4-6 is he says, I will not forget Jerusalem. I love this part. He says, I won't forget. Twice he says it. I won't forget. And he's not just talking about not forgetting the geographic place of his birth, but he's saying, I won't forget the promises that God made about Jerusalem, about the Israelite people. God made these promises to Abraham that they would have a nation and a land, and that from them a Messiah, a king, a savior would come. And he's saying, I won't forget any of that. Even in the midst of this pain and suffering, I will not forget. And then he turns to God with his pain, and in verse 7 he says, God, remember. Now, whenever the Bible talks about remembering, whenever people ask God to remember in the Bible, it's saying remember and act. And he's saying, God, remember what you've promised, and remember your justice. And so instead of like taking revenge, instead of this blood revenge, he actually just brings his pain to God and says, God, you act against the Edomites, the neighbors who while Israel is being destroyed, they're laughing and saying, lay it bare. And then against the Babylonians, who in verse 80 says they're doomed to destruction. So there's two things the psalmist is certain about. Number one, that God's promises to Israel and to God's people will happen even after all this tragedy. And number two, that God's justice will come. And he's saying, God, bring your justice. He's not going to take justice. He's asking God to bring that justice. And I was just thinking about how beautiful that the Messiah did come through God's people. God brought his people back from exile, and the Messiah, Jesus, did come. And in him, you find this perfect justice and perfect mercy on the cross. You see, the reality is that God sent his only son to be dashed on the rocks of Calvary in order that we might experience mercy and salvation and deliverance and perfect justice, both on the cross and God's wrath in hell. And so we see this justice coming that we can be certain of, along with God's mercy. So, Lincoln, keep reading the Psalms. Finish strong.